The theatre of the Restoration was quite different from Shakespeare's theatre, with the audience now largely upper class. There were only two licensed or patent theatres, the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, and Duke's House at Lincoln's Inn, which moved to the Covent Garden Theatre in 1732. Actresses could now perform on stage, the first being a Mrs. Coleman in a private performance of Sir William de Evenant's The Siege of Rhodes in 1656, when theatre performances were still officially suppressed. The lifting of the ban led to an explosion of dramatic writing, but of a very different kind from the drama of Shakespeare and his successors. Shakespeare's plays were still presented, but usually in adapted versions, to make them more acceptable to the new tastes of the time. In The Tempest, for instance, Prospero's crisis of knowledge, echoing Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, is completely absent. Marlowe's play was in fact also rewritten in 1697 to meet Restoration tastes as a farce. The more worrying of Shakespeare's excesses had to be trimmed to find acceptance in Restoration society. Nahum Tate reworked King Lear to provide it with a happy ending. He cut the more disturbing elements, such as the putting out of Gloucester's eyes. With harmony restored, the family virtues upheld. Shakespeare's most probing and tragic examination of the man's inhumanity to man becomes a moral and reassuring tract. Tate's King Lear was to be the standard version of the work for almost 2 centuries. We generally notice two kinds of developments in the period of Restoration drama, namely the heroic plays and the comedy of manners. These plays were quite different from Elizabethan plays in some ways. Heroic plays showed the heroic virtues in noblemen, and the women were described as wonderfully beautiful. The tragic drama of this period was made up of heroic plays which were mainly written in heroic couplet. The main character in these plays was torn between the patriotic duty to their country and their duty as a lover. In these dramas, we find brave heroes, beautiful women, a great deal of shouting, and many things. John Dryden was a famous dramatist of Restoration period. He was a genius who had perfect command over stagecraft. His plays were greatly successful on the stage. His best heroic plays were The Conquest of Granada and Aurangzeb, which he had used the rhymed form. The second one is about the struggle for empire in India. His famous play, All for Love, deals with the tragic love of Antony and Cleopatra and was written in blank verse. It is supposed that he wrote this play by improving Shakespeare's play Antony and Cleopatra. Of the tragedies by other dramatists, there are the best heroic plays written by Thomas Otway. They include Don Carlos, The Orphan, and Venice Preserved. The last one was his well received and best play. The most significant noted trend in the British theatre was found after the restoration of the royal power in England in 1660. A new type of drama came out which was known as the Great Neoclassical Tragedy or Heroic Tragedies of Restoration period. The source of inspiration of this type of tragedy was France and some other parts of the continent. The heroic plays of the Restoration forms a class by itself and stands between tragedy and romance. The subject matter of these tragedies are mainly chivalrous, honor, love, and war. The conflict between love and honor is tried to be depicted in a romantic setting presenting grand heroic personalities with a superhuman ability. The subject matter of heroic tragedy has dealt with improbable situation or any sort of grand heroic feat. The problem of heroic life indeed constitutes the essence of theme of the war, battle, fight, and so on. This type of drama presents heroic problems and conflicts which result ultimately in human glory and death. The development of heroic tragedy has its beginning in the Great Elizabethan period and found continued in the Restoration Age. The heroic tragedy is usually written in the rhymed heroic couplet. Heroic tragedies tried to follow strictly the classical rules of the unity of time, place, and action. Among the great heroic tragedies mentioned must be made of Dryden's, the Indian Emperor, the conquest of Granada by Spaniards, Aurangzeb, and All for Love, etc. The Restoration period is particularly remarkable for comedy of manners and heroic plays. Dryden, who wrote heroic plays, turned to tragedies in blank verse, resembling Shakespeare's tragedies in choice of subject like All for Love, Don Sebastian, the Spartan Hero, etc. In these tragedies, he shows qualities which his heroic plays lack. He presented plausible people and simple emotions in fitting language and without bombast. He had drawn to nature and thus both to Shakespeare and to French tragedy, particularly to Racine. Dryden's plays are primarily products of conscious will and artistic talent. Dryden could not recover the strong tragic emotion of his predecessors. Thomas Otway succeeded best in studying the feelings of the audience through his two powerful plays, The Orphan and Venice Preserved. The former is a domestic tragedy steeped in the romantic atmosphere, and the latter is a moving study of passion and character against a background of history, which is the Spanish plot against the Venetian Republic in 1618. The tragedy is built on a series of closely knit scenes of increasing emotion. The hesitation of Jafar, one of the conspirators between the political cause he is pledged to promote, and the appeals of his dearly loved wife, Belvidera. The struggle between friendship and love, the betrayal of the conspirators, the curse he draws upon himself from his bosom friend, Pierre, his despair when the Senate violates its promise to spare the conspirators he has denounced. It is a moving tragedy which earned an honor which did not fall to any of Dryden's plays. Heroic play was a form mainly specific of the Restoration period, though instances continued to be written in the earlier 18th century. Dryden was particularly distinguished in the composition of heroic plays. Heroic plays were not the result of classical influence. They preserved in their composition the freedom of the national theatre. They took their rules from neither Latin nor Greek. They owed much to France, but more in content than in form. They reproduced the extraordinary adventures typical of the 11th century French novels. Here are superhuman feats, sentiments refined to absurdity, magnificent and sometimes execrable passion. There are no characters, only extremely effective situations allowing of high sounding pompous speeches. The heroes are models. They are unequaled in valor and are incomparable lovers. The plays are generally full of magnificent speeches as they are found in the French novels. The influence of the French heroic romances and tragedies explains why most of the themes turn on the conflict between love and honor. The conflict is found in Beaumont and Fletcher, but the Restoration rationalizes it. Dryden says in one of his prefaces that love and honor, the mistaken topics of tragedy, were quite worn out. Dryden, in his essay on heroic plays, points out an heroic play ought to be an imitation of heroic poem, and consequently, love and valor ought to be the subject of it. By heroic poem, he meant epic, and the plays attempted to emulate the epic by including a large scale warrior as hero, an action involving the fate of an empire, and an elevated and elaborate style usually cast in the epigrammatic form of the closed heroic couplet. A noble hero or heroine are typically represented in a situation in which their passionate love conflicts with the demands of honor and the hero's patriotic duty to his country. If the conflict ends in disaster, the play is called an heroic tragedy. Dryden popularized this type of drama. Although he was anticipated by Orris the Black Prince and George Cartwright's The Heroic Lover, Dryden gave at least 5 of these dramas to the theatre between 1664 to 1677. The Indian Emperor, Tyrannic Love, The Conquest of Granada, Aurangzeb, and All for Love. His highest achievement is his adaptation in All for Love of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra to the heroic formula. He wrote this play in blank verse, while other plays were written in rhyme. There were other heroic dramatists who were of little account. Cetils Cambyses, Nathaniel Lee's The Rival Queens, Hannibal's Overthrow. Thomas Otway wrote Don Carlos, which is one of the most perfect of these heroic dramas. Thomas Otway's Venice Preserved is a fine tragedy that transcends the limits of this form. We also owe indirectly to heroic tragedy two of the most divesting of dramatic parodies: the Duke of Buckingham's The Rehearsal and Henry Fielding's The Tragedy of Tragedies.